The history of salting roads in the United States has slight controversy depending on what part of the country you ask. If you ask members of the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies, they argue that New Hampshire was the first state to de-ice roads, and they began using granular sodium chloride on an experimental basis in 1938. They also go on to state that by the winter of 1941 to 1942, a total of 5,000 tons of salt was spread on highways nationwide. A report by National Geographic, written by author Brian Howard, openly claims Michigan as the first state when he states Detroit was the first city in the world to apply salt to its roads in 1940. As you can see, these timelines don't perfectly match up. It is still interesting to note that the use of salt to de-ice roads is a relatively new practice. The United States needed a new way to protect its drivers during winter as the number of people on the road increased. It is obvious that the United States needed a way to increase safety precautions. Even though the use of salt to de-ice is noble, its impact can now be felt. Research conducted by the University of Minnesota through the St. Anthony Falls Laboratory produced a report named The Inventory of Road Salt Use in the Minneapolis-St. Paul Metropolitan Area. And this report states that in the northern regions of the U.S. and in Canada, a water contaminant of increasing concern is chloride. The source of chloride contamination is mostly sodium chloride, NaCl, which is used in large quantities for road de-icing. As concerns for ecosystems rise, it is becoming of larger importance that people, institutions, and the United States take notice of what we are doing. A report from AccuWeather, written by Tuthill, found that one salt mining company alone, American Rock Salt, is responsible for producing 10 to 18,000 tons of salt each day. It is time more Americans learn what is going on the streets they live by. I decided to ask a few members of the CFANS community what their thoughts were on de-icing practices in Minnesota. The first question I asked was, what are your overall thoughts on how Minnesota deals with winter ice?
I think that depends on where you live, because where I live does a horrible job of it, and I think that they should use more de-icers so people don't get in so many accidents. But there are also places I think that do a relatively good job of it. So, depends.
I mean, we're probably one of the best states for it, especially Minneapolis is pretty amazing. They clear streets within like an hour of snowing and stuff like that, at least the major ones.
Ooh, well, I think they do a pretty good job with it. I have no complaints. It's a balance because people want safety on the roads, yet you got to be mindful of what you're doing in the environment for your own safety too. So I guess there's a bit of a balance there.
I think it's, I guess, as good as it can be considering our climate and the environment that we live in.
To truly understand how salt de-icing affects the environment, it is important to first understand how salt is currently used. Minnesota Department of Transportation states that the amounts of salt used vary considerably from year to year depending on the severity of the winter. The winter of 2012 to 2013, a particularly severe winter, we used 304.6 thousand tons of salt and 44.3 thousand tons of sand, which compared to 2014-2015, considered a more average winter, we used 173.9 thousand tons of salt and 39.8 thousand tons of sand. With this knowledge, I decided it would be interesting to ask the CFANS community about how they think salt affects the environment. I first asked, how do you think salting, de-icing roads affects the environment? Here's what they said.
I personally believe that there can be negative impacts to the environment because I'm aware that salt does have a negative effect on plant growth when in excess.
I think it erodes a lot of the environment, and the chemicals aren't very good for the environment.
I'm guessing it has negative effects in the form of how salt gets washed into waterways, like going to rivers and streams and lakes and stuff like that, which I'm guessing happens a lot here because there's a lot of salt. Probably also messes up your grass.
I think there's a lot of sodium and chlorine that is going into the water each year as the salt is melting along with the snow, and I think that could have a potential deadly effect on the fish as freshwater fish are not used to the high salt content of the freshwater.
I then asked, do you think road salt is toxic? To which I received the following responses.
Probably, yes.
In high quantities, yes.
I think it has the potential to be toxic. It's overused.
Yes, I think it could affect some of our, I guess, plant systems and I'm sure if animals would ingest the salt, it's probably not good for them.
I don't think it's immediately toxic, but I think if there's an accumulation of enough of the salt that it could be toxic.
I think to an extent I do feel it's toxic to the environment and how it affects soils in the areas that it's used.
Now to reveal what the experts say. Greg Renning, an author and journalist from INSEA, states in his November 2017 article that chloride is the component of salt of greatest concern for aquatic life. Chloride has been shown to be benign at low concentrations, but as concentrations increase, salt can kill plankton, disrupt aquatic communities, increase algae blooms, and stunt fish. This means that an increase in salt use, or even a continuation at current levels, could lead to a loss in biodiversity. The National Research Council of 1991 investigated the effects of salting on roadside vegetation, and the Minnesota Stormwater Manual reported that roadside vegetation can be negatively impacted by absorption of chloride through the plant roots or from accumulating on the foliage and branches. The symptoms associated with salt impacts are similar to those of drought: stunted growth, brown and falling leaves or needles, dying limbs, and premature plant deaths. Just imagine what excess salt left from winter does to groundwater, animals, and streams. Even though there are quite a few negatives to salting roads, we can't completely dismiss its necessity. Salting roads does have a direct correlation to fewer automobile accidents and increased safety of pedestrians traversing roads and walkways. This did lead me to wonder if there are any alternatives to salting that keep people safe. Let's first see what people had to say when asked, do you think there are any alternatives to salting roads in the winter?
Well, I know that salting provides the de-icing aspects that we need, but I'm wondering if we could use more like sand, because I know that they also use sand, so maybe that, I don't know.
I personally do not know of any.
Not that I know of, no.
Well, most of the time when we really need it, it's too cold for the salt to work. I think it's like 18 degrees or something to the point that it makes water melt. So there's a lot of points when it's like -20 for a week where salt doesn't really do anything, like sand is probably better. But at the same time, I would rule for more consistent snow plowing funding than salt funding or other stuff like that.
I'm not aware of any. There may be more environmentally friendly alternatives out there, but I'm not aware of any, so we'll see. I don't know.
Nothing immediately comes to my mind, but I've seen a lot of sand being used before, and I think that could reduce the amount of salt that we would need to use, as well as using more sand.
I think there might be alternatives. However, I feel that salting roads in Minnesota is probably the most efficient way of making roads less slippery for people to commute and get where they need to go.
Upon research, I found that there are currently few viable alternatives to using salt for de-icing roads. The main alternative that Minnesota uses is a salt solution rather than directly applying salt rocks. Minnesota Department of Transportation explains why. The salt solution acts as a barrier so the snow and ice won't form a strong bond to the pavement, thus making it easier to plow off snow accumulation. They also go on to explain their use of sand as an alternative. Minnesota Department of Transportation will use sand for traction when the temperatures are very cold and chemicals won't work, or during freezing rain events. But the benefits of sand applications are very limited. Sand doesn't have any ice melting properties. Abrasives are also very easily displaced by traffic. There are also negative environmental impacts such as air pollution and siltation of waterways. Sand costs more than salt when you factor in the higher application rates, frequency of applications, costs of sweeping, and disposal. Overall, keeping people safe needs to be a priority, but knowing the cost associated is important. Do your part to reduce the amount of salt you use on your own yard, and if you live in a city that uses a lot of salt, reach out to your representatives and ask if there is a mutually beneficial solution. Everyone together can make a difference.